He is risen indeed. Alleluia. We are in front of the chapel, inside of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, where it is believed that Jesus Christ rose days after he had been crucified and killed and laid to rest. This place is a place of great importance for Christians. If Jesus Christ has been raised from the grave as the apostles have taught, then our faith is validated and Christ is victorious. And if not, as St. Paul says, we are the most pitied among all men. Before we go any further, let me make a very brief point. We've mentioned the testimony of the apostles and how important the testimony of the apostles is to proclaiming the gospel of Christ. Of course, the apostles, many of them, go on to die for their proclaiming of the news that Jesus Christ is the Son of God, who was killed by sinners in order to save humankind from sin, and that Jesus, the Son of God, rose from the dead and defeated death on the third day. Some of you might say, well, there's lots of crazy religious people that have died for their beliefs, so what makes this any different? Unlike the religion of the Prophet Muhammad, and unlike the religion of someone like Joseph Smith or Buddhism, or really any other major religion, Christianity has, for its basis, multiple witnesses. Joseph Smith was the one who claimed to see the gold tablets. Muhammad was the one by himself who claimed to be visited by the angel Gabriel in the cave. In Christianity, however, we don't have one witness. If there was only one witness, I wouldn't be a Christian. Keep in mind that the Muslims who are dying for their faiths, they don't know the truth. They weren't there. They weren't with Muhammad in the cave. But the early Christians who died for their faiths, like Matthew and Peter and Paul, well, they lived at the time of Jesus. They knew Jesus. In the case of the 12 apostles, they walked with Jesus for years under his discipleship. They knew him. And they claimed to the point of their own death that they had seen the risen Jesus. Not one of them, not two of them, not five of them, but all of them. In fact, outside of Judas, all the apostles, from the records that we have, remained true to the confession that Christ had risen. And so, yes, the Christian faith is dramatically different than the other major faiths of the world because of the multiple witnesses who knew Jesus, all saying the same things and suffering for it. So now we're going to turn to the very central issue in the Christian faith, and that is the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ. Did this event happen? So we're going to deal with several different possibilities. The first one is going to sound initially like it might have some credibility to it, maybe, and then we'll just show how it's downright absurd. And then later we'll be looking at the big issue, which is the resurrection. Before you can rise from the dead, you have to die first. So let's ask the question, firstly, did Jesus actually die? Believe it or not, there are some who explain the resurrection of Jesus by claiming that Jesus actually did not die at all. In fact, did you know that there's an entire religion, the religion where the guy's in the cave hanging out with Gabriel, that claims that Jesus did not die on the cross, but rather the religious leaders and the Romans made a mistake and they accidentally crucified the wrong guy. To illustrate this, we're going to be watching one of my favorite TV shows of all time. It's called Islamic Kids, and as is the true fashion for anything that is Islamic, images of the prophets, of which Jesus is one, are completely disallowed. So when you see Jesus, or what the Muslims call Jesus, Isa, walking around in this little video, he'll be all blurry because you can't make an image of Jesus.
By the time Prophet Isa alayhi salam was 30 years old, the priests had become very angry at him and they made plans to kill the Prophet. One night, the Prophet was sitting along with his 12 companions in his house. He said, "One among you is going to betray me." It was true, and it was none other than Judas. Judas had gone to meet the head priest that day. "What will you give me if I deliver Isa to you?" Judas asked the priest. "We will give you 30 pieces of shekels," the head priest replied. Judas was ashamed of himself and he left the room. The Prophet then asked any one of his companions was ready to take his place, as the soldiers were coming to arrest him. "Who among you will be ready to take my place?" asked the Prophet. "You will be my companion in paradise." A young man stood up and readily agreed. When the soldiers arrived to arrest the prophet, they took the young man instead and crucified him. Before the young man was crucified, Prophet Isa alayhi salam was raised from a window in the corner of the house. Prophet Isa alayhi salam is now alive in the second heaven. He shall descend before the day of judgment.
That was such a wonderful story.
What a great kid's story. All right, guys, so maybe Jesus didn't actually die on the cross. According to the Muslims, maybe Jesus wasn't crucified at all and it was actually a different disciple. Meanwhile, he flies off, which means the disciple probably didn't have to die. But whatever. And so the theory runs something like this. Jesus swooned on the cross and was later revived in the tomb when he made appearances to his apostles. Therefore, he could say, "See the nail prints in my hands and in my side," and still be alive. It kind of makes sense. But does this theory hold water? So what is this theory called? It is called the swoon theory. Jesus swooned, fell asleep on the cross. Very tiring. Eventually nod off. Never know. A little nap. The swoon theory argues that Jesus didn't die on the cross, but fell unconscious. Not that he was, taking a nap. That was overstatement, a bit of hyperbole. And later, Jesus revives in the tomb in the same mortal body. And maybe he appears a few times before he dies of infection. Is this a very good argument? Well, at first you might say, well, that makes sense. Given the fact that so many people did see Jesus after his resurrection, it's very unlikely that we're dealing with hallucinations. For when people hallucinate, they don't have the same hallucination. They have different hallucinations. If everyone's out there eating mushroom soup, they're going to have different hallucinations. What's one of the ways that you know that you're not hallucinating? When you see something unbelievable, you look over to your friend and you say, "Are you seeing what I'm seeing?" Because when two people are seeing the same thing, that suggests that it's not hallucinatory. So when you have 500 people seeing the same thing, of course, there can be various interpretations about what is being seen by the 500 people. But if they're all seeing the same something, it gives credence to the fact that something is actually happening. And so here we have a possible explanation. 500 people did see the resurrected Jesus, but the problem was he wasn't resurrected. Jesus had simply fallen unconscious on the cross and woke up in the tomb and then appeared later to some disciples. But is this actually a likely argument? Well, let's look. First, the Jewish leaders wanted to make sure that Jesus was dead. 2, multiple witnesses claimed to have seen that Jesus was dead at the scene, on the cross. Multiple people take him down and carry him to the tomb. Multiple biblical accounts recall that the tomb door was sealed and that guards were placed in front of the tomb door. And that even if Jesus had been alive, which is not possible, he would have likely suffocated inside the tomb anyway, with it being sealed closed. The biblical accounts also say that Jesus' body had been speared to make sure that Jesus was dead, and that Jesus was dead when he was speared. And this is the best argument. Roman soldiers with the vocation of crucifying people didn't fail. Failing at your job of crucifying people is a good way to get you crucified yourself. Additionally, the Romans didn't go out and do a survey for the kindest, most lovely, jolly good fellow in order to be put in charge of crucifixions. Kind of like the Nazis didn't go around looking for lovey-dovey people to be in the SS. The biblical accounts also discuss how before Jesus went to the cross, he was beaten and bloodied and so thoroughly weakened with the horrific punishments that were exacted on him by Pilate. And to be fair, Pilate was probably trying to make sure that Jesus would not be crucified by placating the mob by having him scourged. But regardless, Jesus was scourged before he went to the cross, and so he was already severely weakened, which would explain why Jesus had died before the criminals on either side of him. He was already severely weakened before he got to the cross. And then finally, the witnesses that saw Jesus reported him being normal and healthy and miraculously transformed days after the crucifixion itself. If Jesus had somehow survived the beating and the crucifixion, reports of seeing him days later healthy would not make any sense at all. To put it exceptionally bluntly, Jesus died on the cross. Crucifixion was not a pleasant way to go. Jesus was beaten before he got there. He was weak, and then he died. So why discuss this? In order for Jesus to rise again from the dead, he needs to die first. Jesus definitely died on the cross. And the next argument is the more challenging argument. Did Jesus rise from the dead? Let's examine that question next.